He noticed the bruises before she even realized her sleeve had slipped, and by the time the night was over, the man who put them there had unknowingly sealed his own fate. Cover-up makeup had become Claire Bennett's quiet ritual over the past 7 months. Foundation blended carefully along her jaw to hide the faint yellow shadow of a healing fingerprint. Concealer pressed in deliberate taps over the tender skin circling her right wrist. Powder dusted lightly, so nothing would smudge under the heat of the dining room lights at Bellissimo, the upscale Italian restaurant tucked into a historic brownstone in downtown Boston where politicians, venture capitalists, and men with private drivers came to pretend their money bought them taste. She wore long sleeves even when the kitchen temperature climbed past 90 degrees, even when sweat collected at the base of her spine, because fabric was easier to explain than bruises, and she had grown very skilled at explaining things away. She was 26, 3 months from finishing her physical therapy certification at Northeastern, 3 months from having a job stable enough to leave Ethan without worrying about how she would pay rent, 3 months that felt like 3 years whenever his temper flared and his apologies followed in the same tired cycle of flowers, promises, and accusations. The previous night he had kept her awake until nearly dawn, pacing their apartment, demanding to know why she needed strangers more than him, why she insisted on staying in school instead of appreciating how hard he worked. And when she refused to quit her program, he had grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave 4 distinct marks, squeezing as if trying to imprint ownership into bone. Table 14 is yours tonight, her manager, Victor, had told her that evening with a warning look, nodding toward the velvet-roped section near the back where the lighting was softer and the wine list more expensive. And be sharp. That's Alessandro Vitali, he'd added in a lower voice, as if the name itself carried weight. She followed his gaze and saw the group immediately. For men in tailored suits cut so precisely they might have been sewn onto them, posture relaxed but alert, conversation quiet yet commanding, and at the head of the table sat Alessandro, mid-30s perhaps, dark hair brushed back from a strong brow, a faint scar near his left temple that caught the candlelight, his white shirt open at the collar beneath a charcoal jacket that fit with understated perfection, a gold watch glinting at his wrist when he lifted his glass. And though she had served wealthy men before, plenty of them, there was something different about him, something controlled and watchful rather than loud or indulgent, the kind of presence that made other diners lower their voices without knowing why. "Water?" she asked, keeping her tone professional, steady, the practiced smile in place. And when she leaned forward to pour, she felt his gaze settle on her not in the usual lingering way she had learned to deflect, but in a focused, assessing manner that made her acutely aware of the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she favored her left side where a bruise along her ribs still ached from Tuesday's argument. She moved through her spiel about the specials, handmade pappardelle, imported burrata, a Brolo Victor had been pushing all week, and Alessandro nodded politely, yet never glanced at the menu, his eyes remaining on her with a patience that felt less like scrutiny and more like calculation. The dinner rush swelled around them, silverware clinking, low laughter rising and falling like background music, and Claire lost herself in the rhythm of service until a small misstep snapped her focus. As she lifted a tray of wine glasses, her cuff snagged against the stem of one, the tray tilting precariously, crystal threatening to shatter across polished wood, and before she could correct it, a hand closed around her elbow, firm, steady, controlled, riding both her and the tray in a single precise motion. She inhaled sharply at the contact, the strength in his grip unmistakable yet measured, and in that split second her sleeve rode up, exposing the bruises circling her wrist in full view beneath the soft amber light. Silence fell at the table, subtle but palpable, as Alessandro's gaze dropped to her arm and lingered just long enough to register understanding before lifting to meet her eyes. And the temperature in her chest shifted from embarrassment to something sharper, because this wasn't the curious glance of a customer noticing a flaw. It was recognition, clear and unflinching. "You should be careful," he said evenly, though the words held a weight that extended far beyond spilled wine, and she quickly tugged her sleeve back down, heat rising to her cheeks. "It's nothing," she replied, defaulting to the lie she had rehearsed countless times. "I bruise easily." His expression didn't change, but something in his posture tightened, a fractional adjustment that suggested restraint rather than disbelief. Bruises like that, he answered softly, usually come from someone who forgets their own strength. The men beside him fell silent, their earlier conversation dissolving into watchfulness, and Claire felt suddenly exposed, as if the carefully constructed facade she wore every shift had been peeled back with one accidental movement. She forced a light laugh, murmured another apology, and retreated toward the kitchen, her pulse hammering in her ears. Yet throughout the remainder of the evening, she sensed his attention tracking her movements, not possessively, not with entitlement, but with a deliberate awareness that made her acutely conscious of every flinch when Victor raised his voice, every guarded turn of her body when navigating narrow spaces between tables. When she returned with the check near the end of the meal, Alessandro signed it without comment, sliding the folder closed before standing, and as his associates rose and buttoned their jackets, he paused long enough to place several crisp bills beneath his water glass along with a business card embossed in understated lettering. He didn't make a spectacle of it, didn't lower his voice conspiratorially or lean in too close, simply met her eyes with calm certainty. In case, he said, tapping the edge of the card once with his finger, a situation requires assistance. The word hung between them, undefined yet unmistakable, and before she could respond, he turned and exited the restaurant, his presence parting the crowd with quiet authority. Claire remained standing there for a moment longer than necessary, the weight of the card heavier than the money itself as she slipped both into her apron pocket, telling herself she would throw it away later, that accepting a tip did not mean accepting an invitation. That powerful men with scars and silent entourages were not solutions to problems like hers. But as she finished her shift and stepped out into the cool Boston night, the city lights reflecting off rain-slick pavement, she found her fingers tracing the raised lettering through the thin fabric of her apron, memorizing the number without meaning to, because for the first time in months someone had looked at her bruises and seen not clumsiness, not weakness, but injustice. And that recognition, quiet, dangerous, and unwavering, felt like the first crack in a cage she had almost convinced herself was permanent. By the time Ethan dragged her into the alley, Alessandro Vitali had already decided the man gripping her wrist was about to learn a very permanent lesson. Saturday night at Bellissimo was in full swing. Crystal glasses clinking, low laughter spilling across linen-draped tables, the kind of polished elegance that had ugly truths beneath soft lighting. And Claire had almost convinced herself that the previous evening had meant nothing, that powerful men didn't notice waitresses, that business cards with private numbers were just gestures. She was wrong. The front door slammed open just after 8, and Ethan stormed in, smelling of whiskey and resentment, his eyes locking onto her with immediate accusation as he crossed the dining room floor without hesitation. "Claire," he shouted, loud enough to turn every head. "We're talking. Now." She hurried to intercept him before he could create more of a scene, her voice low and urgent. "I'm working. Please, not here." But Ethan thrived on humiliation, and before she could step back, his fingers clamped around her wrist, the same wrist he'd bruised days before, squeezing hard enough to make her gasp. "You don't ignore me," he snapped, yanking her toward the door despite Victor's threats to call the police. "You belong to me." The words sliced through her as he dragged her outside, around the corner, into the narrow service alley behind the restaurant where the pavement was still damp from earlier rain and shadows stretched long against brick walls. He shoved her backward with brutal force, her spine striking the wall as his forearm pressed across her throat, cutting off her air. "You think I didn't see you last night?" he hissed, breath hot and sour against her face. "Taking money from that guy?" Smiling at him. "I wasn't," she choked, clawing at his arm as her lungs burned. "Ethan, I can't breathe." His grip tightened instead of loosening, his anger escalating in a way that felt different this time. Heavier, reckless, and black spots began creeping into her vision as panic surged. Then suddenly the pressure vanished, and Ethan's body jerked violently backward, slamming into the opposite wall with a stunned grunt. Claire collapsed forward onto her knees, coughing desperately for air, and through blurred vision, she saw Alessandro Vitali standing at the mouth of the alley, posture relaxed, expression carved from controlled fury. "You made a mistake," Alessandro said quietly. Ethan staggered upright, too drunk to recognize danger. "Who the hell are you?" he spat, charging forward with a wild punch that Alessandro sidestepped effortlessly. In the same instant, two men appeared from behind him, moving with silent precision, one catching Ethan's arm and twisting it behind his back, while the other pinned his shoulders, immobilizing him within seconds. "This is none of your business," Ethan shouted, struggling uselessly. "She's my girlfriend." Alessandro's gaze flicked briefly to Claire, taking in the red marks already forming on her throat, the tremor in her hands as she steadied herself against the wall, and something in his expression hardened further. "No," he replied evenly, stepping closer to Ethan, who now looked more confused than defiant. "She isn't." He crouched beside Claire then, careful, measured. "Are you hurt?" She swallowed painfully and shook her head, though tears burned in her eyes from shock and lack of oxygen. Alessandro stood again, adjusting his cuffs as if concluding a business transaction. "Take him," he instructed one of his men calmly. "Make sure he understands." Ethan's bravado dissolved into panic as he was marched toward a black sedan idling at the alley entrance, his heels scraping against wet pavement. "Claire, tell them," he yelled, but she remained silent, watching as the car door opened, then shut with quiet finality. Moments later, the vehicle disappeared down the street, taking his anger and threats with it. The alley fell still, except for her uneven breathing. Alessandro turned back to her, his voice steady, almost gentle now. "He won't hurt you again," he said, not as reassurance, but as certainty. And for the first time since the bruises had started appearing, Claire believed it. By morning, Ethan was gone, not in the dramatic way men like him usually left, not with slammed doors or shouted threats, but with a silence so complete it felt deliberate. Claire woke in their small apartment to stillness, the kind that made her sit up immediately, heart racing, half expecting him to burst from the bathroom with another accusation. Instead, the closet hung open with empty space where his jackets had been, his shoes missing from by the door, his toothbrush gone from the sink, and on the kitchen counter lay nothing but her own reflection in the dark microwave glass. No note, no apology, no warning. His phone went straight to a disconnected message when she tried it. By noon, she learned through a mutual acquaintance that he had taken a job opportunity out of state, leaving suddenly, no forwarding address. The explanation felt thin, rehearsed, like something arranged rather than decided. Claire sat on the edge of her bed for a long time after that call, fingers brushing absent-mindedly over the faint tenderness at her throat, and for the first time in months, she realized she was not bracing for the sound of a key turning in the lock. That evening she went to work, unsure what to expect, but Bellissimo hummed as usual, polished and composed, and Alessandro Vitali did not appear. There was no dramatic follow-up, no possessive claim, no expectation waiting in the shadows. Only peace. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet held. Claire finished her clinical hours without distraction, slept through the night without fear, and began packing her things not in secret but in certainty, signing a lease on a small studio across town with windows that faced the sunrise. She kept Alessandro's card tucked in her wallet, though she never used the number. She didn't need to. The message had already been delivered, not just to Ethan, but to her. She was not property. She was not alone. And one evening, nearly a month later, as she stepped out of the restaurant after a late shift, she noticed a familiar black sedan parked discreetly across the street. Alessandro stood beside it, hands in his coat pockets, expression unreadable yet calm. He didn't approach her, didn't close the distance. He simply met her eyes from across the pavement, offering the smallest nod, not ownership, not invitation, just acknowledgement. A confirmation that the door she had been too afraid to walk through alone had been opened. Claire held his gaze for a quiet moment, then nodded back before turning toward her bus stop, the cool Boston air filling her lungs without restriction. Behind her, the car engine started softly, and when she glanced once over her shoulder, it was already pulling away, leaving her not indebted, not claimed, but free.